So, Michael Dunning, thank you so much for joining me. You are presenting at the Yin Center Conference, April 1st through 3rd, and your presentation is The You Mysteries and the Celtic Roots of the Divine Feminine. So, tell me about the You Mysteries and how you discovered them and what they are.
Well, thanks, David. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conference very much. The You Mysteries were given to me really in seed form, probably almost 30 years ago, by a female you.
Now, tell people what a you is actually.
Yes, I'll get to that. Yeah,
okay.
Female yew tree in the south of Scotland, and I can come back to that in a moment actually and describe the yews a little bit. So about 30 years ago, I was given the seed form for this, spending time under this female yew in the south of Scotland, and I actually spent 9 years being healed. I was very, very sick when I was drawn to that yew tree, and I'll describe the tree in a minute. And I spent 9 years under that tree going through a healing process. But what was really interesting about it was it's not as though the healing process involved simply becoming normal again and functional again. And that, of course, that was part of it. But what was more interesting and more informing of the future was the language that came out of the healing itself, like almost like a language of embodiment, if you like, that led me to have a sense of the presence of forces, the workings of forces and beings that were not really of this world as such. And as I explored that a little bit more, I began to realize that the forces and beings of this world were really vivifying, saturating forces that stood behind this world, this kind of physically manifest world, informed it, healed it, vivified it, saturated it. And after quite a bit of time, it took me a long time to really understand a lot of this, but that invisible world, or that mysterious world, was the world that the ancient Celts referred to as the other world.
Oh, wow.
And what I said there, I mean, that's quite a lot to say, that it took me a long time, like 25 years, to bring even a language to that I could even begin to bring into the world as a form of teachings, which I've called the You Mysteries. But the yew tree is a very extraordinary being, and the yews are essentially regarded as a conifer, although that's been questioned many times over the years, and the definition of conifer was extended to kind of include the yew, because it does so many things that are not conifer-like.
It
doesn't have a kind of cone type of growth. It actually, the female yew has a red berry, or what's known as an aril, in the autumn, which is a very distinct red, fleshy, pulpy berry form with a seed inside.
Sounds very feminine.
Very feminine. Seed is highly toxic. In fact, everything of the yew is highly toxic and even deadly, except for the red flesh of the seed, or the aril. And what's quite remarkable about the yew tree is that they can be either expressing male or female. And what's even more remarkable about the yews, as we've discovered over the years, is that they can switch sexes. They can switch sexual expression as if at will. So there's a yew in Scotland, for example, in Fortingall, which is kind of in the center of Scotland, actually, very central, like the axis mundi of Scotland. And there's a really ancient yew there that began to reveal female branches. It had been male for a very long time. And So this you can have a male expressed you with suddenly will begin to develop female branches, and you can have vice versa. So the U is very plastic in its expressivity.
Mhm.
So that to me was something that became very important. This kind of being that stands beyond the polarities of manifested understanding of sexual expression. You know, this kind of larger, bigger being that fundamentally, though, I've always regarded as an expression of the divine feminine.
Mm.
And we can kind of come to that in a moment if you like.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about that.
But the U has a very interesting, it's a very unusual tree. It's, if left to its own devices, it will tend to grow back down towards the ground. So you'll have a trunk and it will kind of grow out like a Gothic cathedral,
Mm.
great arching branches that will then grow back down towards the ground
Mm-hmm.
to create a kind of a sealed chamber, if you like. And those branches will root, but they'll also create branch runners that travel along the ground to produce growth further out peripherally.
Mm.
So what you sort of get there is a self-contained forest, all of the one tree that then has a sort of the one I spent time at is probably the most perfect expression that I have ever seen of this self-contained you, where actually you would have to basically navigate a 40-foot long tunnel of branch contortion, and you'd have to
Wow.
crouch to get in it and navigate through it. You could stand up at certain points, but move through there. And that tunnel would kind of rise up for 40 feet and bring you into this great chamber of entirely self-contained chamber that was a little bit like an inverted cauldron, or people can
Oh.
imagine an inverted basket or
Mm-hmm.
cauldron.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I spent that majority of my time over those 9+ years, going through this process of essentially of healing,
Mm.
and a lot more that I'm currently writing about in a memoir. So there's a lot to those 9 years that, you know, obviously we wouldn't be able to go into now.
Yeah.
Um, um, and it was really that I began to realize that there was a sort of, as I said, there was a sort of feminine signature to this,
Mm.
the presence there, and Iris began to refer to it as the mind of the you.
Mm.
And this mind had a very, very feminine presence to it. So it wasn't just that the you was expressing itself manifestly as this female expressed being, but actually that there was another depth to that was felt to me to be extremely rich and very feminine,
Mm.
in a sort of very nurturing way. And it was that experience that over many years that really brought me into this understanding that I just mentioned earlier, that I was actually being healed by sort of forces and presences that were not exactly of this world, that there was an otherworldly quality about that sealed off space,
Mm.
so that you was able to take this space and sequester it, seal it off from ordinary space, and within that space things could happen
Wow.
that the laws of, we understand ordinary kind of natural laws, were not really, didn't have the same sway, if you like. So other forces could be there, other forces could be present. And I felt that those were the forces that were actually healing me and changing me. And it was really through, as I say, deepening my understanding of those forces that led me to begin to research years later the Irish and the Welsh material, the mythological material. And I was quite stunned when I began to see aspects of my own healing process reflected back at me in some of the actual stories.
Mm. Wow.
And that was quite striking. So I come to the mythological material more from the opposite end. So for me, it's not that I chose to study it because it was cool to study. For me, it was, I needed to understand my experience of what had happened to me inside beneath this tree for all of these years. What was that? What had happened? And I couldn't really find that reflected in there was nobody to really ask about that. There was nobody had seemed to have any knowledge or understanding of it. I looked eventually into things like shamanism, and that gave me some help. But
so there isn't culturally other people who are connecting with the yew trees in this way that you experienced, or there isn't anybody who's passing this on to somebody. You hadn't found anybody else who'd had this kind of experience, or just even something close to that?
Nothing close, no.
Wow.
And I still have not. I mean, now that things are a little different, there's more, the internet, there's more communication, and plus with the mystery school having been run for several years now, there are more people, exploring the yews. There's more awareness of the yew trees in the UK, for example, particularly in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And I get, more correspondence from people saying they experienced this or they experienced that, but nothing consistent the way I.
Wow.
Plus, at the time that it happened, we're talking here from, 93 was when I first was drawn to the yew, after a long experience of illness before that, prior to that. So it was between 93 and 2003, roughly, that a lot of my experiences took place. And gradually I began to realize that there were one or two people who were writing about the yew, who were fascinated by the yew. And slowly we kind of came together, and there's a small community of us who are, researching and trying to bring some of this consciousness back to light, if you like. It's a very big story with the yew, and and I guess from the purposes of the conference,
yes,
is how does this yew speak of the divine feminine, and how might we come into relationship with that? And should I talk a little bit about that?
Yes, please. Yes. Get us back on our track.
And for me, I think it always comes back to experience first. And as I said, having gone through the experiences I had over that period of time, and then looking at the Irish and the Welsh mythological material, I stumbled upon the Ceridwen myth. And when I saw the Ceridwen myth, I began to see that language, that otherworldly language, that was present for me as a force in my healing. I began to see that almost described in the mythological material.
Oh, wow.
So Ceridwen, the story goes through a whole sequence that perhaps we can break down more during the larger conference, and perhaps do a little exercise around that then. But basically, there's a sort of sense of going through the three wombs of Ceridwen.
Oh, wow. And Ceridwen, can you say who she was? She's a she.
This goddess figure, this initiatory goddess who I can say a little bit about the story. She's the cauldron keeper, the cauldron tender. And the cauldron was always a symbol for the mysteries in the ancient world. So she's a cauldron tender. And sort of very briefly, the story that really struck me was this story of her preparing this brew in her cauldron. And she's preparing this brew to administer to her son, Avagthi, who is otherwise known as Black Wings. He's the so-called, in the story, these stories are codified, and we must understand that they're codified. They have lots of initiatory knowledge embedded into them. This is what I discovered. And so her son Black Wings was his name, Avagthi. And the idea was that she was going to brew this potion for a year. and that the potion was going to confer not only beauty but wisdom to her son. So she had to go away for a while, and she allows she wants the cauldron to be tended while she's away, and she asks Guyon Bach, this character called Guyon Bach, to tend the cauldron while she's gone. Now we must understand that these events are otherworldly events. These are not physical manifested worlds we're talking about here. This is the other world we're talking about here. These events are taking place in a very, very sort of refined, literally otherworldly way. So Guyon Bach is stirring the cauldron, and as he's stirring the cauldron, 3 drops of the fluid fly out of the cauldron and touch his skin, and it's quite burning. So he quickly takes his hand into his mouth and takes his 3 drops into himself. And as he does that, he gains all wisdom. The wisdom that was intended for the son is gained by Guyon. And immediately as that happens, the cauldron splits. It's no longer ever going to be able to be useful again. So Ceridwen discovers this and then basically goes in pursuit of Guyon Bach. And Guyon Bach, there's a whole series of transformations that go on as she's pursuing him. He constantly tries to conceal himself as animals, that then she makes herself into the prey of that animal. And she catches this Guyon Bach, and no matter what Guyon Bach does, he can't get away from Ceridwen. So finally, as a grain of wheat, he's gobbled up by Ceridwen, and she becomes pregnant. And she has this, so you start to see the sense of these wombs emerging, these otherworldly wombs. So this being begins to be developed in her woman. When the being is birthed, the being is so beautiful, she cannot possibly destroy this being. She sets the being afloat on the waters, so to speak, in a bag in Welsh, which is called the ball croin. It's a skin bag, and it's actually translated as a skin belly. So there's all these really rich. So this skin belly, this ball croin, is then floats down this water and is picked up eventually by a father and son who are out hunting. And they open the ball croin, they open the bag, and there's a shining, radiant being, tiny being called Taliesin, shining down. And Taliesin is able to speak and recite wisdom. So a lot of what that story really is about is really about the coming out of an incarnational process, coming out of the other world, the stages of incarnation coming from the other world, this kind of human becoming that moves through these stages of coming out of the other world, out of the place of origin, out of that primal place. And it gradually, you see these transformations through these wombs to finally in the ball croin, in the skin bag, and finally this being is born, who is then really, what we're looking at there is a codification in a way of us understanding our own coming out of the other world, our own process of human incarnation, of becoming. So one thing I learned very strongly was that the other world is a place of origin. It's a place that vivifies. It breathes through the world. It saturates the world constantly. It's a place of what we might call health. And so when I saw this and I understood this, I began to see this shape of an initiation. Shape of an initiation of coming through these wombs of the human being coming to incarnation. And over a period of time, I began to work with that more and more and more, with groups and with individuals in my healing practice, until I'd found a shape that to me was a shape of a kind of an initiation that an individual could, or a group could use to essentially go back to that place of origin and begin to come back into that place of originality. and reclaim some of that original wholeness and begin to bring that as an embodied sensation into ordinary, incarnate life. So there was a way of kind of reclaiming something original given to us from the other world and bringing that into the world as a force of health and hope.
Well, and I'm hearing that in relation to the rebirth of the feminine as well, to this combination of how I am thinking of it is both a remembering and then an evolving into something totally new. And that, to me, what you're saying very much speaks to both of those processes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you mind? We need to close our conversation because of time. And this is the juicy, exciting, fascinating work that you're going to bring to the conference, where we'll get to dive in much deeper.
It's exciting.
So we'll leave it hanging on this cliff edge, if that's okay.
Fine with me. And hopefully it makes sense what I was saying.
Oh, yes. Yes. It feels like, yeah, we came around this circle and here is our story to begin from. So just to repeat that your session is called The You Mysteries and the Celtic Roots of the Divine Feminine. And you'll be working with this story of Ceridwen and the cauldron. And I can't wait to find out how you lead us through that and to hear more, happening April 1st through 3rd. So thank you, Michael, for this. I look forward to more soon.
Thanks, David. I look forward to the conference. Thank you.
Okay.